Many of you are aware of our pollinator program, Plant, Grow, Fly. Started in 2014, the project encourages citizens in the community to plant specialized butterfly gardens for our declining butterflies and bees in their yard, at their school, or at their place of business. We've had such an overwhelming response from our community, and I'm proud to report today that we are over 170 registered Plant, Grow, Fly gardens, mostly in the state of Iowa, but actually all over the region, some in Virginia, one in New York. I had a meeting a couple weeks ago with a fellow who works at Parks in Manitoba, and he's going to register some gardens up there as well. Our goal is to have 500 gardens by the end of this year, and I'm sure that many of you in this audience are some of our registered participants, so thank you very much. The success of Plant, Grow, Fly is built on a foundation of partnerships. We now have over 30 local, regional, and national partners, including Ryman Gardens, Polk County Conservation, the Science Center of Iowa, Iowa DNR, Monarch Joint Venture, and many more. Through our combined audiences, we're reaching out to many more people, many who have little to no knowledge about the decline of butterflies and bees, and how easy it is to make a difference just by putting plants in the ground. One of those pollinators that's in trouble has captivated so many of us with its beauty, grace, and astonishing migration. We are honored tonight to have a leading expert on the monarch butterfly in our midst. She is a professor in the Department of Fisheries, Wildlife, and Conservation Biology at the University of Minnesota, conducts research on several aspects of monarch butterfly ecology. She is passionate about the conservation of the world's biodiversity and believes that the connections her projects promote between monarchs, humans, and the natural world lead to meaningful conservation action. She is the chair of the Monarch Joint Venture and a founding officer of the Monarch Butterfly Fund. In 2013, she received a White House Champion of Change Award for her work with citizen science. It is my deep pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Karen Oberhauser.
Thanks for that great introduction, Jessie, and thanks to the Blank Park Zoo for inviting me. I'm really excited to be here with all of you tonight. So what we're here to talk about is monarch butterflies. It's really exciting to talk about monarchs. I love monarchs. I've been studying them for 31 years. And what I'm going to do tonight is kind of take you through a story, but I'm going to start kind of talking about conservation. So I'm a conservation biologist, but I went to college and graduate school before conservation biology was even a field. So my degree is in ecology. So I've kind of grown up with this new field. So I think a lot, and I teach conservation biology at the University of Minnesota, and I think a lot, really, what does that mean? What does conservation biology mean? So as an ecologist and as a scientist, I think that a really important thing about conservation is knowledge. In order to preserve the world's biodiversity, and I think the fact that you're all here tonight means you're interested in biodiversity, we have to think about what organisms need. We have to think about how those needs can be met, why in some cases the needs of organisms aren't being met, and then what we need to do to assure that the needs are met. But knowledge is not enough. We can go out and study things until we're blue in the face, but conservation also requires action. We have to do something with our knowledge. So hopefully after tonight, you'll be inspired to go out and act. And the other thing I want to leave you with is that we're getting more and more bad news in the world. I mean, we think about climate change and invasive species and habitat loss, air pollution, water pollution. There's just kind of a lot of bad news out there. But I think another reason that all of you are here, and the reason that I'm a conservation biologist, is that we have hope. Okay, we wouldn't be doing what we're doing, we wouldn't be in this audience or in this room if we didn't have hope that things we do can make a difference. So tonight I want to talk about knowledge and action and hope. So this is kind of an outline where we're going, so if you need to nod off a little, you'll kind of have a roadmap for where we're going. I'm going to talk to you about the life cycle of monarchs, their very interesting life cycle. And then I'm going to talk about why we're in this room, why people are so interested in monarchs. why we all recognize and know and love monarchs. Then talk about what's happening to monarch populations, why these things are happening, and then finally how we can respond to these changes. You can tell I'm a professor because I move around a lot. This is when I can't run in the morning, I move when I'm talking. Okay, so let's start with this complex and interesting life cycle of monarchs. So when I think about the monarch life cycle, I kind of think about two different kinds of a life cycle. So when we think of our own life cycle, we think of we're born, we're a baby, we're an adolescent, we're a young adult and an older adult. So we kind of have this, what I call an individual life cycle. And for monarchs, their individual life cycle starts out with an egg. They're an egg for about 4 or 5 days, depending on how warm it is. Then they become a caterpillar or a larva, and it's totally okay to say caterpillar. Some people kind of sneer at you when you say caterpillar, but really, caterpillar is a more exact term because a caterpillar is the larva of a butterfly or a moth. So when you say caterpillar, you're being exact. If you said larva, it might be an ant larva or a beetle larva or a bee larva or any other kind of larva, even a fish larva. So the caterpillar or larva, then we have the pupa stage, the very beautiful pupa stage that my graduate students often say is their favorite stage of monarchs because it takes absolutely no work to take care of them in the lab. And then we have the adult, and then the cycle starts again. So we have this 4-part process, and to get from the egg to the adult stage takes approximately a month. It's about 4 days as an egg, 4 to 5 days, 9 to 11 days as a caterpillar, and about the same amount of time as a pupa, 9 to 10 days. And then they're an adult, and the adults live about a month in the summertime. So there's the life cycle. So we'll just look at a few pictures of this. Oviposition is just laying eggs. Monarchs lay eggs only on what kind of plants? Yes, good, milkweed plants. The books I gave you are field guides to a milkweed habitat, so all the different things you see on milkweed. We have some great handouts over there showing you different kinds of milkweed. So that's the only parental care that monarchs provide for their offspring. They lay them on the right species of plant. So when the caterpillars hatch, like you see one doing on that upper picture right there, it's chewing its way out of its eggshell, or its chorion is the name for that eggshell. They hatch out, they eat that eggshell, and then they start eating the milkweed plant that they were laid on. Usually, you see one egg on the bottom of a milkweed leaf. Usually, you know, most milkweed plants you look at have 0 eggs on them, but you rarely see more than one, but sometimes you do. So this is actually a picture taken in the wild, and this plant has 6 eggs on it. So there's the first stage, laying eggs, eggs hatching. The larvae, or caterpillars, go through 5 larval instars. So there's a new word for maybe some people. Instar is spelled I-N-star, S-T-A-R. And an instar is the stage in between a caterpillar shedding its skin. So a monarch goes through 5 caterpillar instars. So that means it sheds its skin 5 times. So here we see the picture of the egg. That's about as big as a pinhead. The first instar comes out of the egg, eats. There you can see one eating. And they don't get those characteristic black and yellow stripes on them until they eat some milkweed, because the milkweed has the pigment in it that gives them their coloration. So that is a monarch there. It just hasn't eaten any milkweed yet. It's starting on its eggshell. We have a first instar. It sheds its skin, becomes a second, a third, a fourth, and a 5th instar. And the amount of weight that it gains from this first instar stage to this 5th instar stage, remember this takes about 10 days, it gains 2,000 times its body weight. So just do the math in your head. If you have a 7-pound baby and it gained 2,000 times its weight in 10 days, you would have a very large baby. Luckily, our children don't gain weight quite that fast. So we think of caterpillars shedding their skin because their skin can't stretch enough. Their skin doesn't grow as much as our skin grows with us. But they do grow within each larval instar. So this picture here is 2 second instars. So you can see that this little one just shed its skin, just became a 2nd instar. This is ready to become a 3rd instar. But the skin does grow with them. It stretches and grows with them, but it just can't get from this size to this size. So that's why they have to shed their skin. Then the last time they shed their skin is when they turn into a pupa. So the fifth instar molts its skin, and underneath its skin is the pupa. So they don't spin a covering like a cocoon does, like a lot of moss species spins a cocoon that protects them. The skin of a butterfly is there. The pupa of a butterfly is just its skin. It's just what's underneath the old skin. So here you have a caterpillar that's found a place to become a chrysalis, so it's hanging upside down. Well, in this case, a milkweed leaf, but usually they crawl off their milkweed. It starts splitting, and you can just start to see right here, you can see the skin start splitting right in the thorax part of the body behind the head. And then here you can see the old caterpillar skin. It's shedding that skin. Here you can see the wing of the butterfly shedding that skin. And then it kind of does what one of my graduate students called the pupa dance, where it's holding upside down and just kind of wiggling around back and forth and trying to shake that skin off of itself. And that skin then falls down to the ground. Here it is. It's happy it got its skin off. And then it kind of gets its shape, kind of stretches out in there, and becomes the chrysalis shape that we're used to seeing. So you might have read that when a caterpillar turns into a chrysalis, the whole inside of it turns into a liquid, mushy stuff that then magically turns into a butterfly. Well, that's not true. It has a lot of the organs that will become the butterfly when it's still a caterpillar. And you can see this here. This is only a couple hours old, and there's the wing. It's already formed. So there are a lot of organs that will be organs inside the adult that are present in the caterpillar. So if you read that again, you'll know the author didn't know what they were talking about when they wrote that. There are some muscles, like all of those extra leg muscles, that the adult doesn't need. Those do get broken down, but a lot of the structures are already present that will be in the adult. Okay, so it's in that pupa stage for 9, 10, 11 days, depending on temperature. It goes faster if it's warmer. And then it's ready to emerge as a butterfly. So we start to see the wings, and that's not because the covering becomes transparent. That's because one of the last things to happen in there is that they develop the scales, or the little scales on their wings that will give their wings their color. So we're starting to see that. Here we see it eclosing, and I heard from the people that were selling the t-shirts that we weren't sure what the word eclose meant. Here, I'll show you the wonderful t-shirts. This. That says eclose. That's saying, come out of your shell. Because the word eclose means when the adult emerges out of the chrysalis casing. So here you see it coming out. It's holding on with its legs, and then it flops down. It takes a while for the wings to expand, and it pumps blood into its wings, and then we have the butterfly. So I bet that there are some people in this audience that can tell me which one of those is the female and which one of those is the male monarch. Very good. What's your name? Thank you, Wyatt. Very good. So there's our monarch expert, I can tell. So he pointed out these are the patches that only the male has. Those are called androconial scales. They're specialized scales on the hind wings. The female's bands are a little bit wider than those of the male. She also has more kind of darker brownish scales in between these veins, too. So we call this sexually dimorphic. They're a little bit different, the two sexes, but they're pretty similar. A male and a female look quite a bit alike. Oh, there's the answer, but you didn't need that. Okay, so they're an adult, so we got them to this fourth stage, the adult stage. The adult has no chewing mouth parts, where the caterpillar has chewing mouth parts that it can use to eat milkweed. The adults only have a proboscis, like a tongue, and they can only drink nectar from flowers. So here we have one on a zinnia. The adult is nectaring on this flower. Can we tell if this is a male or a female? And Wyatt, it's no fair for you to answer this question. Anyone tell me about, is that a male or a female? What do you think? A girl or a boy? Yeah, right there. Did you get the answer? It is a female or a girl. Very good, because it doesn't have those dots. Excellent. Okay, so it has body parts that all insects have. It has a head and a thorax. The wings and the legs come off of the thorax. It has an abdomen where its stomach and its reproductive organs are. And like all butterflies and moths, it has 4 wings. 4 like the number, F-O-U-R. And those wings are called, the front 2 are called forewings, and the back 2 are called hindwings. So there are the important parts of a butterfly or a moth. All right, so that's the individual cycle. Now let's take them through their annual cycle. So they have this other kind of life cycle. They go through an annual cycle that has really 4 parts to it, just like the individual cycle. They migrate south, they overwinter, they migrate north, and then they breed. So we can think of those 4 parts to their annual life cycle. And if we start in the fall, monarchs are leaving this huge area with Iowa right in the middle, and they're leaving, just kind of picking up, leaving these areas, flying down, going through Texas to overwintering sites in Mexico. Some of the ones flying around the East Coast, along the East Coast, miss that turn to the west and head down into the peninsula, that's Florida, and they actually join a continuously breeding population. So this line right here means that there's a population of monarchs down in the southern part of Florida that does not migrate. But most of them, the vast majority of millions of monarchs, go down through Texas and these sites in Mexico. There's a fairly distinct population west of the Rocky Mountains that overwinters in sites along the coast of California. And then there's some interchange between these populations. And we think that there's interchange that goes back and forth across the Rocky Mountains, not a lot, but some. And then some movement from Arizona down to the overwintering sites in Mexico. And we know this is the case because there have been monarchs tagged in southern Florida that have been found in the overwintering sites in Mexico. So they fly down, they do this in September and October, and arrive in these overwintering sites in early November, late October, early November. And they stay in these sites through the whole winter. And then they leave those sites, and the very same butterflies that made this trip down in the fall move back north in the spring, colonize the southeastern part of the United States, and then their offspring come back. So if you see a monarch in your garden in the spring, it wouldn't be one that left there last fall. It might be its child, but it wouldn't be the very same one. Then they go through 2 to 3 generations up here, 2 to 3 breeding generations, and then the cycle starts again. Now, you should probably be thinking, she just told me that they only live a month when they're an adult. But then she said they go down in late October, they stay there all winter and come back. That's more than a month. Good. I hope that I see a lot of people nodding, so you're puzzled. Good. That means you're thinking. They can live longer when they're that generation that migrates. So the adults, there's a couple reasons they can live longer. One is they're going to a very cool place. Now, these are cold-blooded organisms, and they're going to a place where it's cool, so their whole life just slows down. It's like if you could stick yourself in a refrigerator and take yourself out in about 10 years and still be the age you were when you went into that refrigerator. So that's what happens to the monarchs. They go down to this cool place. They just kind of slow down their life. And the other thing is they're not reproducing. Those butterflies that migrate south in the fall are not producing eggs. They're not trying to find females to mate with. So they can live longer because they're saving energy that they would otherwise be using to reproduce. So that sort of illustrates the cost of reproduction. It's expensive to have babies. Expensive to our bodies. Okay, so the cycle starts again, and we could keep going there, but what's nice about monarchs is there are times during the year when the vast majority of the population is staying in one place. And we can count them, so we can keep tabs on how the monarch population is doing. So we have these butterflies in the overwintering sites in California and in Mexico. We can count them when they first arrive and get an idea of how they did during their breeding season. And we can count them just before they leave and get an idea of how they did over the course of the winter. Now, I'm going to show you some graphs in a little while. The ones in California, we can actually, or people estimate how many monarchs there are there. They actually go out and count them. In Mexico, we measure the area that they occupy. So they're on a bunch of trees. We just measure the ground area that's covered by monarch trees. And that's how we keep tabs on the population in Mexico, because there are millions of monarchs. We could never count them all. So we just measure the area. Okay, so putting kind of pictures to this and thinking about this cycle and what do monarchs need? So when they're migrating south in the fall, they don't need milkweed because they're not laying eggs. They need nectar plants. This is an ironweed, and the Plant Grow Fly brochure has ironweed. That's a really great fall plant for monarchs. And they also need roosting sites. They usually roost in trees. This picture I took in Texas, that's a mesquite tree. And by then, there are a lot of monarchs, so you start to see kind of big gatherings of monarchs. But you might have seen that in Iowa. You've seen them. We see them in Minnesota. Has anyone ever seen a monarch tree in the fall? Anybody? Yep. So that's a really fun thing to see. They gather together like this. When they get to the wintering sites in Mexico, they congregate on trees, a kind of tree called an oyamel fir tree. Here you see a big cluster of them. Here you see them flying up. There's light shining on this, so you can't see it that well, but there are a lot of monarchs in this picture, and they'll just fly off of the trees when the sun hits the trees. And then they start back in the spring. Now, in the spring, they start to need milkweed, because at this point, they're reproductive. The males and females start to mate. The females lay eggs, and this is a female laying an egg. You probably have Asclepias viridis, right, in Iowa? Yep. So this is Asclepias viridis. It's a kind of milkweed, green milkweed. So here you see a female laying an egg on that. They need nectar sources. And just to show you that I'm going to talk about native plants later, but I am not a native plant purist. That's a lilac. It's not native, but it's a great spring plant for monarchs. In the summer, they need milkweed, they keep breeding, and that's when the population goes through these 2 to 3 generations. The population gets bigger and bigger over the course of the summer. So here you see a female laying an egg on a swamp milkweed plant, a caterpillar eating, and they continue to use nectar, and then the cycle starts again. So this is a chain, and a chain is only as strong as its weakest link. But the basis of this chain is milkweed. So I go to these overwintering sites in Mexico a lot. I've been in places where I see 1 million butterflies or more than 1 million butterflies. But when I look at them, I think that every single one of those butterflies has a story. And every single story started on a milkweed plant. And most of those milkweed plants were in the Corn Belt, were in the upper Midwest. So we have a lot of responsibility in Minnesota and Iowa and Wisconsin and Ohio and Illinois, because most of those monarchs came from milkweed plants in our backyards or along our roadsides or in our prairies. All right, so that's the life cycle. Now I want to talk about why we're all here tonight, because we're interested in monarchs. Now, I'm an ecologist, and most of my colleagues study organisms that people don't give a hoot about. But people really give a hoot about monarchs. They really care about them. And it's not just in the United States that we care about monarchs. When monarchs arrive in Mexico, they arrive very close to their holiday called Day of the Dead, which is just a couple days after Halloween. It's on November 2nd, so it's just when the monarchs are coming. And monarchs are really a part of the culture of the Day of the Dead. The Day of the Dead is a celebration of people's ancestors. And the butterflies come back, and they represent for people their ancestors who are coming back. So here's a picture of a Day of the Dead at a cemetery. People go to cemeteries and celebrate their ancestors. And here's kind of showing how they connect the monarchs with that. This is a license plate from the state of Michoacan, which is the state where most of the monarchs overwinter. And this is a 50 peso banknote that's worth about $5. And here you see monarchs on it. So there's a lot of monarchs in the culture of Mexico. In the United States, monarchs are the state insect or butterfly of 7 different states. And I looked up what your state butterfly or insect is, and you don't have one. So there is something you guys could get on top of, right? So it's sort of an interesting story how monarchs became the state butterfly of Wisconsin. I do a lot of courses for teachers at the University of Minnesota, and we had a teacher course, and we had a 4th grade teacher from a little town called Matamidi, Minnesota. She went back to her classroom. Then I guess in 4th grade, you study how a bill becomes a law. They studied that, and the teacher said, "What would you like to become a law?" And they said, "We want monarchs to be the state butterfly." And they wrote a bill in their classroom and took it to their legislators, and it went all the way up. That's when Jesse Ventura was our governor. You may remember that. So he signed this bill into law that said monarchs were our state butterfly. So that was pretty cool in 1998. So maybe you guys can start trying to get us, not that it has to be monarchs. There are a lot of cool butterflies in this state. So I know that you just had the flight of the butterflies here. I know there's sort of some tension sometimes between Iowa and Minnesota, so I'm going to do a little bragging here about Minnesota, but how many people saw this movie when it was here, The Flight of the Butterflies? Good, yeah, it was right here. It's moving and magnificent and engrossing and compelling, and it was really great. I think you would agree that it was really good. But I was a scientific advisor for that film, so I worked with the filmmakers. It took them about 7 years, believe it or not, to make that film. And one of the things I did was introduce them to the people that put that tag. For those of you that saw it, there was a tag on a monarch, and Fred Urquhart, who was the guy who was studying where monarchs migrated every winter, because we didn't know where monarchs went back in the 70s. There was a guy named Jim Gilbert. Let's see, where's his name in here? Jim Gilbert. Yeah, so he's still a pretty famous naturalist in the Twin Cities. He was a teacher at that time. He had 2 students named Jim Street and Dean Bowen. Jim Street is now an attorney in Minneapolis, and he was out tagging butterflies. How many people have ever tagged butterflies? Tag monarchs. You put little stickers. If you look at your little fingernail, they're about the size of your little fingernail. You put stickers on the wings. Well, that's how we learned where monarchs went in the winter. And there was this teacher with his 2 middle school students. They put a tag on a monarch, and that monarch, which had the number 397 on it, was found in Mexico by the guy who led this tagging program. So it's kind of a cool connection showing you kind of the importance of us in Minnesota and Iowa and the Midwest. So to present times, a year ago, the presidents of, this is Barack Obama, we know him, President Obama, President Peña Nieto, he's the president of Mexico. This is Prime Minister Harper, the Prime Minister of Canada. These 3 guys got together in Toluca, Mexico last February 2014. They didn't agree on free trade, they didn't agree on the Keystone Pipeline, they didn't agree on immigration, surprise, surprise. This is what they agreed on. They agreed to create a working group to study ways to protect the monarch butterfly. So those 3 men got together and talked about monarch butterflies, and that conversation has had huge repercussions in monarch conservation. There's a lot going on because of that conversation. Here's more evidence that we're really interested in monarchs as people. Luckily, you don't have to take a test at the end of this talk. This is the only point of this is it's a long list, all those bullets up there. And those bullets are a bunch of citizen science programs where people are studying monarchs or butterflies, and they're providing us data to give us knowledge that we need to preserve monarchs. And this is kind of representing this 4-part cycle that I told you about, the fall migration, the overwintering, the spring migration, and the breeding. We have citizen science programs where people are out studying monarchs during every single cycle of that life cycle, every single part of that annual cycle. And this map, I was going to put the one up from today because it just came out, but it just gets us into the south, and I want to show you more. Each one of the points, this is an example of a citizen science project where people are collecting data about monarchs, and each one of these points, so let's just look at one of these points, let's look at that one. That is a person who saw their first monarch of the year, and they reported it to this website. And we can see how quickly the monarchs are coming back. So you can see the weeks up here. Every week, the graph is updated, so here we would be about now. And monarchs aren't quite this far this year, but then they explode into the north. And I'm just going to do it one more time and watch how they kind of stay down here. So they'll get up, kind of cover this area, then they kind of stay here for a couple weeks, then they explode into the north. So the red dots on there are the new generation starting, and the kind of orange and yellow dots are the butterflies that have come back from Mexico. So we can really tell a lot from the data from this. This is really important knowledge in order to save monarchs. Another example of people's interest in the monarch is the fact that they're building habitat. They're creating habitat for monarchs, and they're doing this at nature centers, in their backyards, in old fields. So whenever I look at that picture, which is a picture actually from Michigan, I think of the Wizard of Oz. And remember that when they see that field of poppies? That's, I think, how a female monarch feels when she gets to that field, kind of like Dorothy and her buddies did in that field of poppies. Here's kind of a more realistic density of milkweeds. But we are building these habitats for monarchs and registering them. So this example is from the Monarch Watch program at Kansas. This is a sign that people built this garden, and it's registered as a way station for monarchs. There are actually over 10,000 monarch way stations that have been registered. People are caring about monarchs, and they're creating habitat for them. People also use monarchs as educational tools for art education, for science education, showing life cycles, getting kids outside, looking at eggs and caterpillars on milkweed, taking people into the Mexican overwintering site. So teaching people about the natural world using monarchs as a tool. So I told you that most of my colleagues study organisms that nobody really cares about. So I think a lot about why we care so much about monarch butterflies. And you may have your own reasons, but here are some of the answers that I've come up with. First of all, they're beautiful. I mean, what's not to love about a monarch? They're not only beautiful when they're adult butterflies, but they're beautiful as caterpillars, and they're beautiful as pupae or chrysalids. They're also very familiar. So I have heard lots and lots of stories of people's first interaction or a significant interaction that people have had with monarchs. I'm sure many people in this audience can think back to an interaction that they've had with a monarch butterfly or caterpillar, and it probably has been important to you. So, and they're familiar. We remember them from our childhood. We see them as children, we see them as adults. They're also interesting. Now, I started studying them because I was interested in their reproductive behavior, and these are some cages at the University of Minnesota. These are cages full of monarchs. We're studying their mating behavior, but they've taught us a lot about migration and about interactions between insects and their host plants, about interactions between insects and diseases. There's just a lot we've learned about genetics of insects, so we've learned a lot from monarchs. And finally, they're impressive. Now, if you think of a monarch butterfly weighs as much as a paper clip. You can also think of a dime. It takes 4 monarchs to equal the weight of a dime, 5 monarchs to equal the weight of a penny. They can fly all the way from here to central Mexico. That's impressive. That is an impressive feat, so as people, we think that's pretty amazing, so we're interested in them for that reason. So you can probably think of your own reason and relate to some of those or maybe think of other ones. So I just kind of want to end talking about people's relationships with monarchs by talking about Nicole Kidman, and just to say that I'm happy the whole world doesn't think like Nicole Kidman. I was on an airplane recently, and this was in the Delta Flight magazine, and she said, "It's so bizarre. I'm not scared of snakes or spiders, but I'm scared of butterflies. There is something eerie about them, something weird." So luckily, there aren't that many people in the world that agree with Nicole Kidman. I would be more on the side of H.W. Bates. For those of you that have ever studied mimicry, there are organisms like a viceroy butterfly, looks like a monarch butterfly. And H.W. Bates was a famous biologist way back in the 1800s. And he said about butterflies, He said, therefore, the study of butterflies, creatures selected as the types of airiness and frivolity, will someday be valued as one of the most important branches of biological science. So I would agree more with H.W. Bates and Nicole Kidman, but I like Nicole Kidman still. All right, so hopefully you're convinced that people are interested in monarchs, but despite all of that interest, despite all of our care for monarchs, their numbers are going down. So this is a really depressing graph. This shows you, remember I said that in Mexico, we measure the size of the monarch population by measuring the area that monarchs occupy. The trees that are covered with monarch, how much area do they cover? This is measured in hectares. A hectare is a little bigger than 2 acres. So if you can think of acres. So this is their area occupied. Started being counted in 1993 up until last winter. So this is the start year of the winter. So this is the winter of 2014 to 2015. It doesn't take highfalutin math to tell you that those numbers are going down. This was actually the first year that I went to the overwintering site, so I got to see them at that peak. It was quite amazing. But if we didn't have that peak, we would kind of see, you know, there's certainly a lot of ups and downs, but until 2004, 2005, there's really not much of a trend here. And it's really been in the last decade that the numbers have started to decline a lot. And the lowest year ever was in 2013, and the second lowest year ever was 2014, and the third lowest year was 2012. So we've had the 3 lowest years have been the last 3 years. So there's been a significant and very steep decline in the numbers. This is true in California, the population that is in the western part of the United States as well, but it's not quite as drastic over the last decade. So it's kind of gotten down and sort of leveled off in California, and they measure on both the total number of monarchs reported. These are the numbers over here, so a little over 1 million was their peak, and also the average number of monarchs per site. So you can see definitely we have low numbers, a lot lower than they were in the late 1900s, but they haven't had this really steep decline lately. Because of this, there's been a lot of interest in monarch conservation. Monarchs were put on the Endangered Species Coalition vanishing list in 2014. In 2010, the World Wildlife Fund listed them as one of the top 10 species to watch. And way back in 1983, they were put on the list of something called the IUCN, or the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, put them on the endangered phenomenon list. So they listed the monarch migration as endangered. And one of the things all of these lists pointed out was the fact that monarchs require a lot of habitat, a lot of different kinds of habitat. So they require land that's up here in the Corn Belt, in the agricultural part of the United States. They require land in the south. They require these overwintering sites in Mexico. In order for this migratory phenomenon to last, there's a lot we have to think about. There's a lot of area and a lot of different kinds of habitat that we need to protect. And I know that one of the speakers in this series was a really great speaker on the Endangered Species Act. So if you've gone to all of the talks in this series, you've learned about the Endangered Species Act. Monarchs are currently being considered for listing as a threatened species. So the Fish and Wildlife Service is currently doing their research to figure out if monarchs should be listed as an endangered species or a threatened species. And this petition was submitted last August, 26th of August, 2014. So that's something that we're all keeping track of and watching what's going to happen about that. Okay, so why is this happening? This is kind of the sad part of the talk. First of all, the reason that most species are in trouble is habitat loss, habitat conversion. We're changing the way the world looks. In the United States, we're losing over 5,000 acres of land a day to real estate and energy development. So here's an example of real estate development. This is a suburb moving in. This land used to be fields. In 2006 to 2011, over 1 million acres of native prairie, and that's a very rare kind of habitat. We're plowed up for cropland, And all of this land contained milkweed and nectar plants. So there is a lot of research being done on this. Now, the pessimist in me can look at these numbers and get really depressed. But the optimist in me can look at a picture like this and say, well, that's sad. We lost a lot of really great habitat there, but there's a lot of green left in that picture. And if I studied spotted owls or wolves or a lot of other species, that green wouldn't do any good, but that green can do some good for monarchs. If it wasn't monocultures of non-native grass, which is what we put in our lawns, it could be habitat. We could be putting habitat in those little bits of green spaces that are left, and monarchs could use that habitat. So that's what's hopeful about monarchs. Another thing that's happened, and this is a change in agricultural practices. In 2000, I did a study with several people, including some people at the University of Iowa, or Iowa State. Sorry, no, I shouldn't get those mixed up. We don't have that in Minnesota. We just have one thing. And we estimated that about 50 times more monarchs came out of agricultural fields. And the reason that this happened is there actually was quite a bit of milkweed in corn and soybean fields. So here's a cornfield. There's milkweed growing in this. This was back in the days of slides. So it's a scan slide. It's not that great a picture, but I can't take a picture like this anymore. Here's milkweed growing in a cornfield. Here's a soybean field with a milkweed plant, a female laying an egg on it. So we went out, people collaborating in this study all over the United States and into Canada. We found a lot of milkweed in corn and soybean fields, and we found that monarchs were using that milkweed. So then, that habitat is gone, because now farmers can spray these fields with Roundup after the corn and soybeans have come up. So if there was a milkweed plant like this one growing in between the rows of soybean, it's killed and the soybean is still doing very well. Now, I'm not bashing farmers, because farmers do what they can to grow crops well. I'm just saying that we need to understand, we need the knowledge to understand that this has happened, and then we have to do something about it. So I'm not saying we're going to get that agricultural habitat back, but what we need to do is replace as much of it as we can. We have to take advantage of other habitat that's available and make up for all of that milkweed that is no longer growing between soybean and corn rows. And here's just a picture of what happened. So when we did this study in 2000, 50% of the soybeans, this top graph is soybeans, so the percent of soybeans that were planted to herbicide tolerant or Roundup ready, that was the first year there was corn out in the landscape, and this is the average. So this is kind of a picture, if we're assuming that it's about equal amounts of corn and soybean on the landscape, this is about how much of the field, how many of the fields are no longer having milkweed, and now we're over 90%. So we've lost all of that habitat that used to have a little bit of milkweed in it, and monarchs were using that. So that's what we have to make up for. There's also habitat loss in the overwintering sites. That's a different kind of habitat loss. The trees are being cut down. So here you see one of these OML fir trees. You can't really see it with the lights shining on this slide, but this is a tree that came down, and there are monarchs in that picture. So this is happening right in the overwintering sites where the monarchs are. Here's a whole cleared area, and here you see horses coming down off of the mountain, pulling the trees off of the mountain. So it's not only up in the Corn Belt that we're facing habitat loss, but it's in the overwintering sites as well. And then there are a lot of other things happening. So insecticides, when people spray for mosquitoes, they're spraying for adult mosquitoes, they're spraying general insecticides that kill all insects, not just mosquitoes. So here's a study that we did in our lab looking at a monarch caterpillar that had been exposed to an insecticide. We have climate change, and when the monarchs go to these overwintering sites in Mexico, it's the dry season, but we're getting more and more frequent rain or snowstorms, and if it's cold, when it precipitates, the monarchs get knocked out of the trees. Some of these monarchs actually survive this. Some of these are still alive, but most of them get buried by the snow and killed. They get knocked out of their trees and killed. we have kind of the litany of problems. We have invasive species. Now, as far as I know, this has not moved into Iowa yet. It's in Michigan and Minnesota, in Wisconsin, just a little bit in Minnesota. But this is a plant called a swallowwort, which is closely related to monarchs. Do you have them in Iowa? Do any of you know? Do you have swallowworts yet? I don't think you do. But female monarchs will lay their egg on this plant because they think it's a milkweed, but the caterpillars can't eat it. So it's a sink. The females waste their eggs if they lay eggs on this plant. It's getting fairly common. It moved from the East Coast. It's native to Europe, and it's moving across. You know, some people, I had one guy call me about a week ago, and he said the whole problem is cars hitting monarchs. If there are monarchs and there's an east-west highway and it's during the fall migration, monarchs get hit. You've probably seen them in your cars. So here we have a grill of a truck. Monarchs get killed that way. So we have a lot of causes to the decline of monarchs. So we have to decide. We have to understand what's causing the decline and then figure out how we're going to act on this. So I'm going to go back to the beginning and say, I think that we need to keep studying monarchs. We need more knowledge. We need to monitor monarchs to see how the population is doing. And we're not only, the title of my talk is Moving Beyond the Documentation of Declines. Okay, we don't want to only think about monitoring this declining species and watch it get down to nothing. What we want to do is start to monitor our successes. So we want to see what we're doing and how it's helping monarchs. We want to study the factors that affect monarch survival. So what are the good things we can do? What's the best kind of milkweed plant to put in your garden? How closely together should you plant those milkweed plants? We need to monitor this. We have to act on that knowledge. So the big thing we need to do is create habitat. We need to address the fact that we've lost a lot of habitat. We need to put milkweed in the ground, and we have to put nectar plants in the ground. We have to conserve those overwintering sites. We have to educate. We have to get more people involved and support organizations that are working to preserve monarchs. So this picture, you might wonder why I'm putting a farm field in here. That is a milkweed field. And that field, they're growing milkweed to use as seed sources for restoration projects. So that's a very hopeful kind of action. All of these plants are going to produce seeds that we can use. These are kids planting OML trees in Mexico, so we need to get a lot of people involved in creating monarch habitat. And finally, conservation requires hope, and this is what makes me hopeful. It makes me hopeful that you're all in the room. It makes me hopeful that in every country in North America, Canada, the United States, and Mexico, there are organizations and all different kinds of efforts that are working to conserve monarchs, international, cooperative efforts, and a lot of other things. And I'm going to just show a couple slides about the Monarch Joint Venture, which is something that I'm involved with. And actually, we're up to 24 organizations that are cooperating right now to preserve monarchs. Maybe the Blank Park Zoo pretty soon will join that list. One thing about monarch organizations is they have really nice logos. So here we have the logos of a lot of the organizations involved in this, federal agencies, small organizations. This is a little nature center in Texas, big organizations, conservation, all different kinds of organizations. And we're working on monarch habitat conservation. We're working on getting more milkweed in the ground, more host plants. And this can be in big prairies, this can be along roadsides, although Diane will tell me there are problems with roadsides because we don't want too many monarchs to collide with vehicles. At schools, and the basic thing is we need milkweed and we need nectar plants. So here we have a picture of a monarch nectaring on milkweed, but they can nectar on a lot of other plants as well. We need to increase the amount of seed availability. So if there are as many people planting milkweed as we want to be out there planting milkweed, they've got to have access to milkweed seeds. So we need to make sure there's enough seed availability. So here's that field a little later in the summer. All of these milkweed plants growing up, beautiful milkweed seeds. We've focused on priority states. So states where milkweed seed is kind of rare, kind of difficult to find. So that's why we have those priority states. So what can you do? You can plant milkweed. You don't need a lot of space. Nectar sources. Well, there's a handout over there that shows you the kind of milkweed plants that we recommend, so you can be sure to pick that up after the talk. We've assigned different regions of the country, different species. Oh, there's all these very cool, beautiful kinds of milkweed plants that you can grow. A lot of people are nervous about common milkweed because it kind of spreads around in your garden, but there are other kinds that don't spread as much. The nectar plants, what you need for nectar plants for monarchs is the availability of plants throughout the season. So you need plants that are available in the spring, like the lilacs, through the summer plants, the Joe Pye weed, some kind of aggressive ones that people don't like, but it's still a nice monarch nectar source. The black-eyed Susans, a lot of great plants, beautiful plants you can put in your garden that monarchs will love. You can also educate and advocate. So you can plant a monarch way station. You can add we have a success stories place on the Monarch Joint Venture website. You can talk to your friends and neighbors. If you live out in the country, you can see when your ditches are getting mowed and try to keep them from being mowed when there are monarch eggs and caterpillars out there. You can get involved in a monarch citizen science project. You can just Google monarch citizen science. There are lots of fun things. You can see all these people are really having a good time out there studying monarchs. You can donate money to conservation organizations, the Monarch Joint Venture, the Monarch Butterfly Fund, the Blank Park Zoo. There are a lot of organizations working on land conservation that you can give your money to. And I just want to put in a plug. Jesse talked a little bit in the beginning about this really amazing program that started very small just last year at the Blank Park Zoo. This program called Plant, Grow, Fly, which you should all join. The goal this year is 500. You can learn what you should put in a garden. You can register it. You can get one of these great signs. Here you can see, I just took this off your website, but there's not quite 100 dots on there, but there's a really great program. So there are just great programs all over that you can get involved with. So I said we need knowledge, we need action, and we need hope. We also need a little bit of healthy realism. And people accuse me sometimes of being a Pollyanna and being a little bit over-hopeful, but I think I am realistic, and I think that I'm probably never going to go back to Mexico and see the number of monarchs I saw in February 1997 when I first went there. We've lost too much habitat. It's going to be pretty difficult, probably within my lifetime, to replace that. So what I think about a lot is when everybody doesn't see a monarch when they're a kid, when they're more rare, are they going to care so much? So I think our job becomes a little bit harder when nature is not as familiar to people. So that's when the work of organizations like the Blank Park Zoo, getting people connected with nature when they might not be quite as connected anymore, is really important. So we really need to work to maintain this interest and to ensure that this new normal, this number that's probably not going to be back to what it was when you used to see so many monarchs in your gardens. I mean, I have people tell me this all the time. They used to see a lot of monarchs. They're not seeing so many, but we can still see quite a few. So I believe that our efforts will be worthwhile. I think that everything we're all doing together can really make a big difference. And what's really amazing about monarchs is they exist in this mosaic of different kinds of habitat. Monarchs use native prairies, one of the most endangered kinds of ecosystems in the United States. But they also can lay an egg on a milkweed plant that grows up in a crack in a sidewalk. Really disturbed habitats, agricultural fields, your backyards, habitats that aren't really what they used to be, but monarchs can still use them. And one of the reasons that I think it's really important is this migration that I talked about in the beginning of the talk is an unmatched biological phenomenon. There's nothing else like it in the world. No other insect migrates like monarchs do. So this is something that's really worth saving. So I will answer questions. I want to thank all of you and all of the people that have been involved with the work that I've done over the last 30 years with monarchs. So thank you very much. So we can take a couple questions if anybody has any. Or was I just so clear? Yes. Well, there is a really tight, and I tried not to get too mathy in this talk, but I have done some research actually with a colleague at Iowa State named John Pleasance, and John and I published a study showing a very tight correlation between the adoption of herbicide-tolerant crops and the decline in monarchs. They're very tightly correlated. And to your first comment, you are so right, and I teach undergraduates at the University of Minnesota, and every day that I spend with them gives me so much hope. I really do agree with you that it's amazing, the young people coming up. So thank you for that, and thank you all you young people for giving us so much hope. Yeah. Exactly. So that's a really great clarifying question. Thank you for that. So he asked if it's the herbicide-tolerant crops themselves or the fact that the Roundup is being sprayed. And it's the fact that the Roundup is being sprayed, and it's the fact that the milkweed plants are no longer in those corn and soybean fields. Right. So that was actually why we did that study back in 2000. We were interested in the impacts of Bt crops. And in some ways, so Bt crops are crops, for those of you who aren't familiar with them, they produce a toxin to Lepidoptera, a substance that's toxic to butterflies and moths, and that toxin is produced in all of the tissues of the corn plants, the roots and the stems and the pollen. And we were concerned that the pollen would blow off of the corn plants because it's the corn is a wind pollinated plant, and blow onto milkweed plants, and the monarchs would eat it and it would kill them. But that's kind of become a moot point now because there's no milkweed left in those ag fields. So the milkweed will not have Bt pollen on it. Great question. Well, so that's what I used to study. So thank you. She asked, can a female only mate and lay eggs once? Female monarchs will actually mate throughout their lives. They'll mate multiple times during their lives. On average, they mate 6 or 7 times. And they continue, so when they mate, the male transfers not only sperm to the female, but also some nutrients in a package called a spermatophore. So the female kind of like gets a little dinner while she's mating, as well as just sperm. So she can fertilize all of her eggs by mating with one male, but she usually mates multiple times. So the spermatophore is actually digested within the female. There's enzymes are secreted, and it's broken down, and she uses those as nutrition. Yep. So a female will keep laying eggs through her whole life. They kind of peter off. Like she's at her maximum egg production a couple days after she mates for the first time, and by the end of her life, like she might lay 200 eggs a day in the beginning, and then it goes down to like 20 when she's old and tired. Excellent question. The question was, are butterflies affected by neonicotinoids? And these are insecticides that are that the plant takes up, again, constitutively. So it takes it up, the plant takes these up in all of their tissues, and butterflies are affected from this pollen, from the nectar, and also the caterpillars can be affected by feeding on it. Yes. So one thing I worry about, for example, we have emerald ash borers in Minnesota, and people are treating their ash trees, but they're using neonicotinoids to treat their ash trees, and there are a lot of butterflies and moths that use ash leaves, so those will become toxic to things like swallowtails and cecropias. Yep. Yeah, so that's a really good question. Is there any rhyme or reason to how they choose these roost trees? So the Journey North program that I showed you the map of that had them moving north in the spring also has people recording the roost trees as they're moving south in the fall. And the answer to that is sometimes yes, sometimes no, like most questions in science. I have gone to sites in Minnesota where the same trees are used year after year after year. There's a woman that lives in a little town in central Minnesota. She lives in the house that her grandma lived in. She's about my age, and she remembers going to I'm 58. She remembers going to this house when she was a little girl, when her grandma lived there, and there were monarchs that came to her yard. They're still coming to her house. But then there are some that people see once and don't see them again. So there's actually been a study using the Journey North data looking at this, and what they do is they use the most common trees in an area. There seems to be no selection of trees. They're often on edges of wooded areas or like a row of trees, but we really can't figure out what's going on with those roost trees. They're amazing. Oh, very interesting question. Her question was, do siblings breed? So, you know, that's kind of a hard thing to ask in the wild because it's really hard to know who's a sibling and who's not. But I've done a lot of experiments with monarchs in captivity, and they seem to have no compunction, you know, no problem mating with a sibling. We actually don't see, and people have looked at this, there's no evidence of what we call inbreeding depression, so it doesn't seem to be a problem if they mate with their sibling. But, you know, we just don't know how often that goes on in the wild. It's a really interesting question. All right, I will be happy to answer any other questions afterwards, just individually, I think, or I'm not sure if that's allowed. But thank you all very much, and have a great night.